There is a quality to suffering that the Buddha noticed very early. It follows us. We get what we want, and the wanting moves somewhere else. We lose something, and the pain seems to confirm what we feared all along, that something fundamental is missing. He organized this insight into 4 truths. Suffering exists. It has a cause. The cause can cease, and there is a path to that ceasing. The cause has a name: tanha, craving, the thirst that drives the search. The suffering arises from the thirst itself, not from what the search fails to find. Tanha takes 3 forms: the reach toward what brings pleasure, the reach toward becoming someone finally whole, the flight from anything that threatens to hurt. All 3 are the same movement, a mind that has not yet found its rest. When tanha is present, the mind is already in suffering, regardless of what it obtains. The Buddha walked a middle path, between grasping and withdrawal, between indulgence and aversion. Not stillness as escape, but stillness as seeing. Peace does not wait for circumstances to change. It is what remains when craving releases its grip. This is the 3rd noble truth. When craving ceases, suffering ceases. Not when the chase succeeds. When the chase is understood. In what follows, we'll look at what craving is made of, what it means to act without being driven by it, what patience really is, and what remains when the chase finally stops. Just listen. To understand the chase, we have to go to where it begins. Not to the moment we first wanted something, but to the quality of mind just beneath the wanting, the part we rarely look at directly. The Buddha spent years watching this, in himself first, then in the people who came to him carrying their grief and their carefully maintained hopes. What he found was not comforting, and it was also not hopeless. It was this: the chase is almost never about what it says it is about. There is a story from the early teachings that holds this very quietly. It is the story of a man named Ratapala, a man who had everything the world considers worth chasing, who saw something clearly one afternoon and never needed to chase again. The story does not tell us he became cold or empty. It tells us he became free. And the difference between those 2 things is the whole of what this teaching is about. Ratapala was the only son of a wealthy and respected household in a town called Thulakothita. His parents had given him everything that security and love could offer: fine clothes, a large household, the kind of life where the basic questions of survival are settled before they are even asked. He had not known real want. He had not known failure of a kind that couldn't be repaired. By any ordinary measure, he was doing very well. Then the Buddha came to teach in the region, and, Ratapala went to hear him, the way a person sometimes walks toward an open door without quite knowing why. What the Buddha offered that day was not elaborate. He offered 4 observations, 4 ways of seeing the world that the texts describe as summaries of the Dhamma, the teaching. The first observation was this: the world is swept away. Nothing in it endures. The body changes, the circumstances change, the people we love change, the wealth we accumulate changes, the health we depend on changes. We do not live in a stable world that occasionally surprises us with impermanence. We live in impermanence that occasionally gives us the feeling of stability. The second, the world has no shelter. There is no arrangement we can make, no relationship, no achievement, no accumulation of resources that will finally protect us from what the first observation describes. We spend enormous energy building shelters, in money, in other people's approval, in the feeling of having planned far enough ahead. But every shelter has the same flaw embedded in it from the start. The third, nothing in the world is truly owned. The things we call ours, the house, the savings, the relationships, the identity we have built over decades, are circumstances we happen to be moving through. At the end, every hand opens. Every hand. The fourth, the world is incomplete, insatiate, driven by craving. This is tanha, the thirst that cannot be satisfied by drinking. We want, we obtain, and the wanting moves somewhere else. The world does not fail us by being impermanent. The suffering comes from expecting it to be otherwise. These 4 observations landed in Ratapal differently than anything else he had heard. Not because they were new. He had glimpsed each of them at the edges of his comfortable life. But he had never let himself look at them directly. And now, sitting in the presence of someone who had looked at them fully and come through to something like peace, something in him recognized the truth and would not look away. He went home and told his parents he wanted to become a monk. He wanted to go forth into the homeless life, to leave the household, to leave the comfort, to live as a practitioner. His parents refused. They wept. His father said that Ratapal was their only son, their joy, and they could not give permission for this. His mother held him and could not stop crying. His friends came and tried to reason with him. Ratapala refused food. He lay down on the floor of his family's home and told them he would either die there or receive their permission to ordain. This is the moment the text records without judgment, the moment when what a person has understood becomes more pressing than the comfort of those they love. It was not comfortable to live through, but Ratapal was not being cruel. He was being honest about what he had seen. His parents' love for him was real. Their grief was genuine. But their love had something mixed into it that the Buddhist texts call pema, affectionate love entangled with clinging, love that needs the beloved to remain in a particular form in order to feel whole. Their love said, "Stay. It could not separate caring for him from requiring him. Eventually, they relented, with one condition: the Buddha himself had to accept him. Ratapala went, was accepted, received ordination, and entered the practice. He practiced with his whole attention. He was not there by accident, or for social reasons, or because life had disappointed him badly enough to seek an escape. He was there because he had seen 4 things clearly, and he oriented everything around that seeing, the way a plant orients toward light, not by forcing itself, but because that was the only direction that made sense. The texts tell us that within that same period, he attained arahantship, the full release from craving and clinging, the peace that remains when tanha is no longer running the mind. Sometime later, he returned to Thulakothita to see his family. He arrived quietly and rested in the royal park. A servant girl on her way to draw water in the early morning recognized him and hurried back to tell his father. His father went to him at once, embraced him, wept. And then he did what people do when they believe the right offering can solve any problem. He brought Ratapal inside and showed him room after room of gold. Vaults of it, stacked high, glinting in the lamplight, the family's accumulated wealth spread out so that its abundance could not be missed. "This is all yours," his father said. "Come back. What is a monk's life compared to this?" Ratapala looked at the gold and was unmoved, not because he was suppressing some natural pull toward it, but because the seeing that had brought him to practice had genuinely altered what gold meant to him. He saw it the way a person sees water in a mirage, clearly, without being fooled, without needing to pretend it isn't there. Former servant women came and wept near him. A companion from his former life came quietly and asked, "Dear Master, what flaw did you see? What fault did you find in the world that made you give all of this up?" She was asking what so many people ask of those who have let go of what the world considers precious. What went wrong? What were you escaping? Ratapal answered simply, "No flaw, no fault." He had not left because the world was bad. He had left because he had seen it as it is. King Karavya had heard that Ratapala, the young nobleman who had walked away from his inheritance, was staying in the royal park, and he went to meet him. The king was not hostile. He was genuinely curious, in the way powerful people sometimes are when they encounter someone who seems to have stepped outside the gravitational field that holds everyone else in place. The king began with assumptions. He had heard, he said, that people go forth into the homeless life when they are ruined by poverty, by illness, by the death of loved ones, by age. He went through the list carefully, one by one, waiting to see which misfortune had driven Ratapala into the robes. Had he been poor? Sick? Had he lost what he loved? To each question, Ratapal said no. He had been none of those things. He had been a young man with everything, and he had still gone forth. The king could not make sense of this. In his understanding of the world, the understanding of a man who had spent his life acquiring, consolidating, protecting, there was no framework for someone who relinquished abundance freely, without being pushed. Then what moved you? Ratapala offered him the 4 summaries again, the same 4 observations the Buddha had given in the teaching. The world is swept away. There is no shelter. Nothing is truly owned. The world is insatiate, the slave of craving. The king listened. Then he gestured at his own kingdom, the elephants, the cavalry, the treasury, the storehouses full of grain and gold. With all of this, he said, I am among those best placed to enjoy what life offers. How can you say there is no shelter? Ratapala paused. Then he asked the king one question. Suppose you were badly ill, in terrible pain, the kind of pain that takes over everything. Could you command your relatives and friends? Come, all of you. Share this pain with me, so that what I carry becomes lighter? The king said no. No one can do that. Or suppose death was coming, Ratapala continued. Could you command your treasury to open, to offer your wealth in exchange, half your lifespan given to those with longer lives, so that you might live? Again, no. This is what is meant by no shelter, Ratapala said. Not that you have nothing, but that what you have cannot reach where the suffering goes. We spend our lives building shelter, wealth, status, the loyalty of those close to us. And each of these things is real and good in its own way. But none of them can stand between us and illness, or loss, or the fact of death. The protection we accumulate does not protect us from the things that matter most. Then the king tried one more thing. He sent women, his own consorts, dressed in fine clothes, perfumed, ornamented, to sit near Ratapala and speak to him as a husband. A test, or perhaps a hope. If anything remained in this monk, if any thread of craving could still be found, this might find it. Ratapala looked at them. He didn't look away in aversion. He didn't smile in recognition. He simply looked, clearly, without any particular movement in his face. Then he turned to the king. Great king, where do these women come from? The king said they were his own chief consorts. Ratapala nodded. In the teaching, he said, they would be called magically fashioned beings. He didn't mean it as a dismissal. He meant it as a precise observation. When the mind sees clearly, sees the body aging, sees impermanence running through everything, what craving had placed on the object dissolves. Not because the person becomes less, but because what we were reaching toward was never the person themselves. It was the image we had built around them, the promise we believed they carried, the way they seemed to answer something the mind had decided was missing. When craving is absent, we can see people as they actually are, not as mirrors of our own need, not as objects to be obtained or lost, simply as they are, living, changing themselves. The women left. The king sat very still. What Ratapala was pointing to, in his patient way, is what the Buddha mapped with great care. There is a chain. It doesn't begin with what we want. It begins earlier, with contact. Phassa, contact. A sound reaches the ear. A scent reaches the nose. A thought arises in the mind. Someone says something to us on an ordinary afternoon and the words land somewhere in the chest. Contact is the first condition. By itself, it is neutral. It happens thousands of times each day, most of it beneath our awareness, unremarkable, unrecorded. Then comes Vedana, feeling tone, not emotion, something more basic than emotion. Every contact is experienced as pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. The food is sweet and there is a pleasant tone. The criticism lands and there is an unpleasant tone. The background hum of a room is neither. This happens automatically, instantly, before any decision is made. We don't choose Vedana. It arises from contact the way heat arises from fire. Then Tanha, craving. If the Vedana is pleasant, the mind moves toward it, wants more, wants it to continue, wants to hold the moment in place. If the Vedana is unpleasant, the mind moves away, wants it gone, wants it different, wants to be somewhere other than here. This is where the chase begins. Not in the wanting of any particular thing, but in this reflexive movement, toward and away, yes and no, the mind perpetually in motion, perpetually dissatisfied with what is actually present. Then upadana, clinging. The craving solidifies into grasping. We don't just want the pleasant thing, we believe we need it. We don't just dislike the unpleasant thing, we believe our well-being depends on escaping it. The object becomes fixed in the mind. Plans form around it. Strategies develop. We start organizing our days, our relationships, our decisions around obtaining or avoiding the thing we've gripped. Then bhava, becoming. The clinging shapes who we believe we are. I am someone who needs this. I am someone who cannot bear that. I am the kind of person who deserves more, or the kind of person who will never have enough, or the kind of person who must protect what they have at all costs. The sense of self is built, moment by moment, out of what we cling to and what we flee, and then suffering. Not as punishment, not as a verdict on the person, as the natural consequence of a mind organized around reaching and fleeing, never landing anywhere, never resting in what is already here, never quite arriving at the thing it keeps moving toward. This is what the Buddha called dependent origination. It isn't a theory about the cosmos. It is an observation about how the mind produces its own suffering, link by link, moment by moment, without anyone choosing it. The chain is impersonal. but it runs through a personal life, and it costs that life its peace. What makes Ratapal's story powerful is this. He didn't remove himself from the chain by going numb. He didn't stop seeing. He didn't stop hearing. He saw through the chain clearly enough that craving lost its traction. Contact still happened. Vedana still arose. But the reflexive leap from contact to craving, that particular automaticity, had stilled in him. This is what liberation looks like in the early teaching. Not a blank mind, not an empty self, but a mind that can receive experience without immediately reaching out to hold it or push it away. There is something the teaching is careful to distinguish here, because there is a kind of wanting that does not produce suffering, and without that distinction, the path sounds like an instruction to stop caring about anything. Tanha is the wanting that arises from fear, from a sense of lack, from the belief that something is missing, and that obtaining the right object will fill what is empty. It is reactive. It is driven. It needs something outside itself in order to feel whole. Not tanha, but chanda. This is what the teaching calls wholesome intention. Chanda is the natural movement of a heart that cares about something and acts from that care. A parent sits with a sick child through the night, not because they are afraid of being judged, but because the child is loved. A practitioner returns to the breath again and again, not because they are terrified of remaining ignorant, but because clarity is genuinely valued. A teacher explains something difficult for the 5th time, not from guilt or obligation, but from a real wish for the other person to understand. Chanda has no deficit at its root. It doesn't grip. It moves, but it doesn't need the movement to succeed in a particular way in order to feel at peace. The distinction matters because the path is not about becoming still in the sense of becoming indifferent. It is about learning to act from chanda rather than tanha, from wholeness rather than hunger, from something already full rather than something perpetually seeking to be filled. Ratapala's leaving was not despair. His parents wept because they loved him the way of Pima, the love that is tangled with attachment, that needs the beloved to stay close in order to feel complete. But what moved Ratapala rose from something cleaner than Pema. He had seen the way, and he wanted to follow it. That wanting was chanda. We can feel this distinction in ordinary life, even if we don't have the words for it. There is the drive to work hard because we are afraid of failure, afraid of being seen as inadequate, afraid of what might surface if we slowed down. And there is the movement toward work because something in us genuinely cares about what we're making, or who we're helping, or the problem we're trying to understand. The first is tanha dressed up as purpose. The second is chanda. They can look identical from the outside. Inside, one brings a tiredness that doesn't end when the work ends, and the other brings something more like meaning. The Dhammapada records a line the Buddha spoke that echoes quietly through the king's story. From what is dear, grief is born. From what is dear, fear is born. For one who is free from what is dear, there is no grief. Whence fear? Piya. What is dear? What we have made precious through our clinging. The word is not love. It is the object of attachment, the person, the outcome, the thing the heart has gripped and will not release. When we lose what is piya, grief comes. This is not because grief is wrong. The grief is proportional to the grip. The depth of the loss reflects the strength of the clinging that came before it. This is not a moral judgment. It is a description of how the chain works. The Buddha was not teaching that we should not love. He was pointing at two different movements that we both name with the same word, and the confusion between them costs a life its peace. Pema is the love that depends. It calculates. It keeps a quiet accounting of whether the beloved is close enough, constant enough, unchanged enough to justify the feeling of security. Pema says, I love you, and because I love you, I need you to stay as you are and stay close to me. Pema is not evil. It is deeply human, but it contains within itself the seed of its own suffering, because everything it grips is impermanent. Metta is different. The word is often translated as loving kindness, but that phrase has softened in translation. The Pali holds something more precise, a wish for well-being that needs nothing in return. Metta says, may you be well, whether you are near or far, whether you remember me or not, whether you change or stay the same. Metta is not conditional. It doesn't require a particular response from its object in order to keep moving. Metta is the love that doesn't grip. It moves toward others the way warmth moves. Not because warmth is trying to obtain something, but because warmth is its own nature. The king loved his kingdom with Pema. Ratapala's parents loved their son with Pema. There is no blame in that. But Ratapal's equanimity in returning, meeting his father's grief without being consumed by it, looking at the women without craving, meeting the king's clever questions without defensiveness, this was something else. A quality of presence that did not require anything to be different than it was. Contact, Vedana, but no tanha. Here is what the teaching is actually opening in its quiet way. Not a demand for the performance of non-attachment. Not an instruction to suppress feeling, but a question the story leaves open and doesn't answer for us. What is the difference, in this moment, between moving from love and moving from fear? We are often certain we know. We tell ourselves we want things for good reasons. We pursue the relationship, the recognition, the security, because it matters, because we care. And it does matter. But underneath many of these pursuits, when we look carefully, there is a thread of fear running beneath the wanting. The fear that without this we are not whole. The fear that if we stop moving, we will find nothing waiting. The chase does not announce itself as fear. It announces itself as desire, as ambition, as love. It has good reasons. It makes plans. It is very busy. And underneath the busyness is the thing that the four summaries name with such precision. The world is insatiate. Craving, when fed, does not diminish. It finds the next thing to reach toward. Ratapala saw this in his own life before he left it. He was a young man from a good family, respected, cared for, with friends who loved him. By the measures of his world, he had much. And he saw, nonetheless, the structure running underneath all of it, the insatiate quality of wanting more, of becoming more, of a self that keeps expanding in search of a completeness it never quite reaches. He did not leave in bitterness. He left in clarity. There is a difference, and the difference is not small. What the teaching offers is not an instruction to abandon life. It is an invitation to see the difference between the chase and the movement, to notice, in small moments, whether the wanting underneath an action is thin and urgent and fear-driven, or spacious, clear, rooted in something that is already whole. This is the work. Not once, in a single dramatic moment of letting go, but again and again, in ordinary moments, in the texture of an ordinary day, in the quality of wanting that moves through us before we even notice it has arrived. But seeing the nature of the chase is only the beginning. There is also the question of what happens to the mind when it stops forcing, and what becomes possible in that stillness. The mind that stops forcing does not stop moving. This is the first misunderstanding, that the opposite of chasing is stillness, and that stillness means doing nothing. The teaching is not asking for passivity. It is asking for something harder and more precise. Effort without grasping, attention without demand, movement that no longer requires a particular outcome in order to feel worthwhile. There is a story from the canon that holds this distinction very quietly. It doesn't announce its lesson. It simply shows what it looks like when a prepared mind finally meets what it has been looking for, not because it forced the meeting, but because it had become still enough to hear. Pukkusati was a king in the northern city of Takasila. He governed well. He had the things that a life of power and wealth provide: advisors, comfort, the loyalty of his people, the security of walls and storehouses. By the measures of his world, there was little left to want. Then word reached him of a teacher in the south. It came through the ordinary channels of trade. Merchants who had passed through the cities of the Ganges plain and returned with reports. Not reports of a philosophy, not summaries of doctrine, but something harder to describe. Accounts of people who had encountered this teacher and come away fundamentally different. Quieter, lighter, with something in their eyes that the merchants could not quite name. Pukkusati began to practice on his own, in his own palace, without a teacher. He worked with what he could understand from the reports, the breath, the body, the quality of attention itself. He sat. He observed. And over time, something began to shift in him that even his own ministers could sense, though they could not say what it was. But sitting alone in a palace was no longer enough. He wanted to meet the Buddha in person. He wanted to hear the teaching directly, not filtered through the memory of merchants, not reconstructed from second-hand accounts. He made a decision. He gave away his kingdom, shaved his head, took on the plain robe of a wandering monk, and set out south on foot. He traveled to Savatthi first, one of the cities where the Buddha was known to spend his time. The Buddha was not there. He asked at the monastery where the teacher might be found, and continued. Through the heat of the plains, through the rains, village to village, the former king traveled as a monk, with no entourage and no certainty of where the journey would end. Eventually, he arrived in Rajagaha, the royal city of Magadha, as evening was falling. He needed shelter for the night. He found the workshop of a potter named Gata, a simple open space where clay goods were made and dried, and where the potter had a custom of allowing wandering monks to sleep on the floor overnight. Pukkusati entered, thanked the potter, settled into a corner, arranged his robe, and sat in meditation. He was not thinking about the Buddha at that moment. He was not measuring the progress of his search. He was simply sitting, present to the body, present to the breath, present to the quality of the evening. Later, another monk appeared at the entrance of the workshop. He asked the potter if he might share the space for the night. The potter agreed. The monk entered, settled into the other corner, and sat. Pukkusati looked at this newcomer. There was something in the man's presence that was different from anything he had encountered before. A stillness that was not inertness, a quality of alertness that had no edge of anxiety in it, a composure that seemed to arise not from suppression but from something much deeper than that. Pukkusati sat with it. He did not speak. For some time, both men sat in silence. Then the stranger spoke. He asked Pukkusati, simply and without preamble, under whom had he ordained? What was the teaching he followed? Pukkusati said he had ordained in the name of the Blessed One, the Buddha, and that the teachings he followed were the Buddha's teachings, though he had never met the teacher in person. He had set out to find him. He had not found him yet. The stranger asked him to say more. What had he understood of the practice? What had changed in his experience? What did he see when he sat? Pukkusati spoke carefully and honestly, the way a serious practitioner does when asked to account for his own understanding, not performing knowledge, but actually looking at what was there. He described what he had noticed in the body. He described the quality of attention he had been cultivating. He described what he had understood and where the understanding still felt incomplete. The stranger listened without interrupting. When Pukkusati finished, there was a brief silence. Then the stranger began to teach. He laid out the analysis of the 6 elements. Earth. Whatever in this body is solid and dense. The bones, the flesh, the nails and teeth and the hard tissues of the organs. Water. Whatever in this body is fluid. Blood, bile, saliva, sweat, the moisture that keeps every process running. Fire, whatever in this body is heat, the warmth that digests food, the temperature that sustains life, the fever that rises when the body is under threat. Air, whatever in this body moves, the breath, the winds that move through the digestive system, the subtle movements that carry sensation. Space, the openings and cavities, the hollow that allows the rest to exist and function. And consciousness, the awareness that knows all of this is happening, that registers sight and sound and smell and thought. 6 elements, all of them impermanent. All of them arising from conditions they did not choose, sustained by conditions they cannot guarantee, and certain to change when those conditions change. Then the teaching moved further. The earth element in the body is not essentially different from the earth element outside the body. It came from the earth, is sustained by what comes from the earth, and will return to the earth. The water element in the body is not a possession. It flows in and out constantly, the same water that moves through rivers and rain and the bodies of every living thing. None of the elements belong to us. None of them are what we point to when we say I. So, the teaching asked, what is it that we have been calling I? What is it that is chasing? What is it that craves and grasps and flees and accumulates? If the body is a temporary configuration of borrowed elements, and consciousness is a process that arises from contact and passes when contact passes, then the one doing the chasing is itself impermanent. A process, not an entity, a pattern, not a fixed thing, a river, not a stone. As the teaching continued, something settled in Pukusati. He wasn't just hearing this, he was seeing it in his own body, in the breath moving in and out, in the quality of awareness that was present and attending, and not holding on to anything it encountered. Years of practice had prepared the soil. And now, the teaching was landing the way a seed lands in soil that has been carefully tended, not as an idea to be added to a collection of ideas, but as something seen. Near the end of the night, a knowing arose in him. The stranger was the Buddha, the teacher he had traveled for, the teacher he had given his kingdom to find, had been sitting across from him in a potter's workshop for hours, and the teaching had moved through him so quietly, so completely, that he had received it without knowing its source. He asked forgiveness for not recognizing who he was speaking with. The Buddha did not appear offended. He asked to receive proper ordination, the formal ceremony, the full set of robes. The Buddha told him he would need a complete robe to begin. Pukusati bowed and went out into the early morning to find one. On the way, a stray cow gored him. He died before he could return. When the news came back to the potter's workshop, the Buddha declared him an anagami, a non-returner, someone who had seen clearly enough that the conditions for further suffering had been fundamentally loosened. What stays with us in this story, sitting quietly with it, is what it refuses to say. It does not say that Pukusati found the Buddha because he had finally let go of searching. He was still searching. He was still moving south, still a wandering monk with an unfulfilled intention. The story is not about the magical arrival of what we stop chasing. What it is about is the quality of the movement and the quality of the mind that had been shaped by years of genuine effort. Pukasati arrived at that workshop not as someone who had given up looking, but as someone whose looking had become a particular kind of looking. Open, present, not gripping at what it encountered, not measuring each evening against the evening it had hoped for. And it was this quality, this openness, that made the meeting possible when it came. Not in a grand teaching hall, not with announcement or ceremony. In the dark, in a working man's space, between two monks in plain robes, one of whom the other did not recognize at all. The teaching that came that night was a teaching on impermanence. But impermanence, in the early Buddhist texts, is not a source of despair. It is something more interesting than that. Once the implications are actually absorbed, rather than just noted and filed away as a concept. Every act of tanha, every reaching and grasping, contains inside it a belief that the thing being reached for will stay. We want the pleasant feeling to last. We want the person to remain as they are today, the way they look, the way they feel toward us, the particular configuration of closeness and ease we have with them right now. We want the success to hold, the health to continue, the good circumstance to persist. The chase is always a chase after something we believe we can secure, hold in place, keep from changing. Anicca cuts through this belief at the root. Not cruelly, honestly. Nothing stays. The pleasant feeling is already changing as it is felt. The person we love is not the same person they were 5 years ago, and will not be the same person 5 years from now. The body that is doing the chasing is itself a process, arising from causes, sustained by conditions it cannot control, moving toward its own dispersal, whether or not the chase succeeds. The suffering doesn't come from the impermanence itself. It comes from the gap between what is impermanent and the demand that it be permanent. That gap is where the friction lives, the friction of trying to hold a river still, trying to make the moment last longer than conditions allow, trying to keep the person from changing, trying to secure the outcome against a future that has not yet arrived and cannot be fully controlled. When anicca is actually seen, not as a philosophical position, but as something observed in the texture of experience, the grip on permanence begins to soften on its own. Not because we decide to stop caring about things, but because the pretense that what we are gripping is stable has become harder to maintain. We can see it changing in real time as we sit with it. The earth element in the body right now is not the earth element that was here 10 years ago. The consciousness that is listening is not the same consciousness that woke this morning. It has moved through hundreds of arising and passing moments between then and now. The feeling of listening is not the same as the feeling 1 sentence ago. Everything is already in motion, already changing, already dissolving into what comes next. Seeing this doesn't produce emptiness. For Pukusati, it produced something the texts describe as a great settling, the mind landing on something true, something it had always suspected but never seen this clearly before. When we stop resisting the fact of impermanence, when we stop spending energy on the pretense that the impermanent things will hold, something opens up. Not emptiness. Something more like relief. The path addresses the question of effort directly. The Buddha called it samavayama, right effort. It is the sixth factor of the Eightfold Path, and it is commonly misread as an instruction to try harder. The word right is doing critical work here. Sama doesn't mean more. It means wise, effort applied in the right direction, with the right quality, from the right place in the mind. Effort that is grounded in understanding rather than driven by fear. Samavayama has 4 aspects. The first is preventing unwholesome states from arising, not by suppressing them, but by understanding the conditions that generate them and working with those conditions before the state takes hold. The second is letting go of unwholesome states that have already arisen, not by fighting them, but by seeing them clearly and not adding fuel to them. The third is cultivating wholesome states, generosity, clarity, the wish for others' well-being, the qualities that open rather than contract. And the fourth is sustaining wholesome states when they arise, attending to the conditions that support them without gripping the states themselves. None of these 4 are about force. None of them are about pushing harder. They are all about tending, about understanding what conditions support what, and attending to those conditions with care and patience. A gardener doesn't force a plant to grow. She doesn't stand over it demanding that it be taller, or push at the stem to accelerate the process. She removes the weeds that would choke the roots. She provides the right amount of water, not too much, not too little. She ensures the plant has light. She watches what is actually happening and responds to it, rather than imposing a picture of what should be happening. The growing happens when the conditions are right, and the gardener understands this well enough not to confuse the growing with the tending. Right effort is this: tending the conditions of the mind, not forcing the outcomes. And this is a significantly different activity from what most of us call trying. When we try in the way that Tanha drives us to try, we push. We increase the intensity. We extend the hours, raise the stakes, hold the breath against the discomfort of not yet having arrived. And sometimes this produces results. But the quality of the effort, the fear underneath the pushing, exhausts the mind even when the results come. Because we were running on a fuel that depletes. Right effort runs on something else. Not urgency, but care. Not fear of what happens if we fail, but genuine interest in what we are tending. The gardener loves the garden, not because love makes the plants grow, but because love is what makes her attentive to what the plants actually need, rather than what she imagines they should need. Pukusati had been practicing right effort for years before that night in the workshop. His effort was real, The journey south was not a casual undertaking, and the daily practice of sitting and observing and returning to the breath is a form of effort that requires genuine commitment. But the effort was not forcing the Buddha to appear. It was not organizing itself around the demand that things go a particular way. It was tending the conditions of the mind, patiently, repeatedly, without requiring the effort to be rewarded on any particular schedule. And when the meeting finally came, in an unremarkable place, without announcement, without any of the circumstances Pukusati had probably imagined, the prepared mind was ready. Not because the preparation had earned the meeting, because the preparation had created the kind of openness that could recognize the teaching when it arrived without fanfare and receive it without needing it to arrive differently than it did. Here is what not forcing looks like in ordinary life, because it is easy to let this teaching remain abstract. There is the meditator who sits down and immediately begins demanding that the mind become still. She sets a timer. She arranges herself carefully. She closes her eyes and tells the mind, "Now settle." And when the mind continues doing what minds do, generating thoughts, replaying conversations, planning the afternoon, she applies more pressure. She grips the intention more tightly. She checks after 5 minutes, after 10. Is the restlessness gone yet? Is this working? And when the restlessness is still there, she pushes harder, or gives up, or spends the entire sitting fighting the mind into a shape she believes it should be taking. The session ends in exhaustion or frustration, the hollow feeling of having forced something that unraveled the moment she stood up. And there is the meditator who sits down and notices the restlessness. She doesn't welcome it or push it away. She notes it. This is restlessness. This is what restlessness feels like in the body. This particular quality of urgency and unsettledness is what is here right now. She returns to the breath, not because the restlessness has gone, but because the breath is still present, and the breath is what she is tending. Over time, sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes 20, the restlessness shifts. Not because it was forced out, because it was seen, and seeing something honestly tends to take some of its charge away. The difference between these two is not effort versus no effort. Both are making effort. The difference is whether the effort carries inside it a demand for a particular outcome, or whether it is simply the effort of showing up and attending. Clearly, repeatedly, without the attending being conditional on the results. We can see this same pattern in how we are with other people. There is a way of being in relationship that is organized around management, ensuring the other person feels a certain way about us, keeping the relationship moving in a direction we have decided it should go, watching the signals constantly for confirmation that we are loved in the specific way we need to be loved. This is exhausting to do and exhausting to be on the receiving end of. People feel the grip underneath the connection, even when the grip is dressed up as love or care or concern. And they naturally draw back from what feels like a demand. There is also a way of being with another person that is simply present, attending to what they are actually saying, rather than listening through the filter of what confirms or threatens our picture of the relationship. Open to what arises between two people when neither of them is performing a strategy. This is not the absence of caring. It is caring that doesn't require the other person to be configured in a particular way in order to feel like love. Caring that can hold impermanence. The fact that the person is changing as we are changing, and the relationship is therefore always something different than what it was yesterday. In work, the same distinction runs. There is the kind of effort that clenches around results, that cannot rest until the outcome is secured, that sacrifices the quality of the present moment entirely in service of a future that may or may not arrive, and that evaluates every hour by whether it moved closer to the target. And there is effort that stays with the work itself, that brings full attention to what is actually in front of it, and trusts that this quality of attention is worth something even before any outcome arrives. The Pali word for this quality of attention, the open, attending presence that is neither forcing nor passive, is sati. Translated as mindfulness, though that word has been used so widely now that it has softened considerably from what sati actually describes. Sati is a mind that is fully present to what is happening, not overlaid with commentary that evaluates each moment against what the moment should be instead, not organized around producing a particular result, but genuinely here, with what is here, fully enough to receive it. When sati is present, the mind is still moving. It is attending, responding, deciding, acting, but it is not chasing. It is not arranged around obtaining a particular outcome and measuring every moment against that outcome's arrival. It is here, with what is here, and this present quality of being here is itself the thing that right effort cultivates and sama vayama tends. This is what Pukusati had developed across years of practice before that night. A mind that had learned through sitting, attending, returning again, to be present to whatever arose without immediately reaching out to hold it or pushing it away to get back to something more comfortable. This is why he could sit in a potter's workshop with a stranger he had never met and receive a teaching that transformed him, without needing the teacher to identify himself, without needing the setting to be more dramatic, without needing any of it to match the picture of how the meeting was supposed to go. After the 6 elements are laid out in the teaching, after the impermanence of each one is seen clearly, something the text calls upekkha arises. Equanimity, but not the equanimity of indifference, not the flatness of someone who has stopped caring about anything and calls that peace. Rather, the equanimity that arises when the mind is no longer spending all its energy on resisting what is impermanent, or grasping at it, or trying to arrange experience so that the impermanent things will somehow stay. The texts describe this upekkha as bright. The word is precise. This quality of equanimity is not dull. It is more alive to experience, not less, because the energy that was going into the chase has been freed for the actual texture of what is present, the actual quality of this moment, the actual contact of life as it is happening. We spend enormous energy trying to make experience into something other than what it is. The mind that is no longer doing this has more energy, not less, for the life in front of it. More presence, more capacity to receive what arises without immediately organizing it into a threat or an opportunity. More of what we might call simply being here. When we stop forcing, we don't arrive at emptiness. We arrive at what was always here, the fullness of what is actually present, which the chase was too loud to let us hear. Pukusati didn't find the Buddha in the way he had imagined finding him. Not in a formal setting, not with introduction and ceremony, not in any of the ways a person pictures a thing before it happens. He found him in the dark, in a working man's space, in a conversation that began without announcement. And he could receive what came because years of tending had made the mind open enough to recognize the teaching without needing it to arrive wearing its credentials. We do this too. Carry pictures of how insight is supposed to arrive, how peace is supposed to feel, what the moment of understanding is supposed to look like. And because we are measuring each moment against those pictures, we sometimes miss what is actually here. The teaching in an ordinary conversation, the clarity that surfaces not in the grand gesture, but in the quiet, after the noise, the understanding that was available all along, waiting for the mind to settle enough to receive it. The hands that stop gripping don't become hands that do nothing. They become hands that can feel what they're actually holding. The mind that stops forcing doesn't become a mind that stops moving. It becomes a mind that can actually receive what is moving through it. The contact, the vedana, the full quality of this moment, without immediately organizing all of it into a chase. This is the beginning of the practice. And it is also the practice itself, repeated again and again in ordinary moments, noticing when the grip has tightened, not condemning it, simply seeing it and letting the fingers loosen one by one. And when the hands have loosened enough, something else becomes possible. A patience that doesn't feel like waiting because it is not enduring something, it is resting inside it. What resting inside difficulty looks like in practice is best understood through a life, not through a definition. There is a man in the texts whose entire story is a lived demonstration of the quality the teaching calls khanti, the stability that holds without hardening, the patience that rests inside its circumstance rather than enduring it. His name was Jivaka, and his story begins before he had a name, with a baby in a basket, left at the edge of a road before dawn. The woman who placed him there was a courtesan named Salavati, known in Rajagaha, skilled at her work, living a life that had no room in it for a child. She wrapped the infant carefully, or so the texts suggest, and chose a road where the morning traffic would find him. Then she walked away. Prince Abaya was passing that road when he heard what was in the bundle. He stopped and asked his attendants, "Is the child alive?" In Pali, the word for alive is jivaka. When his attendants said yes, he lifted the child and brought him to the palace. The boy grew up in the royal household without being of the royal blood. He had proximity to everything power provides: comfort, education, the company of the court, but not the certainty of belonging that blood carries. He knew who he was and who he was not. He understood that his position rested entirely on a moment of generosity from a man who had happened to be on the right road at the right time, and that generosity, however real, was a different thing from ground. At some point in his youth, the texts don't record at what age or through what precise turn of mind Jivaka understood what his situation required. Not inherited status, not the continued favor of a patron. Something built entirely from his own sustained effort, a skill so thoroughly his own that no shift in circumstance could remove it. He chose medicine. The center of serious medical study in the world he knew was Takasila, the ancient city in the northwest, where knowledge from Persia and Greece and the great river valleys had been gathering for centuries, and where a student who came with genuine intention could receive training of a depth unavailable anywhere closer. Jivaka made the journey alone, from Rajagaha to the northwest, on foot, a journey of weeks through terrain that did not accommodate uncertainty about whether the trip was worth making. He arrived and found a physician named Disapamuk. He was accepted as a student. He stayed for 7 years. 7 years. Not as a sentence to be served, not as an ordeal to be survived, but as the actual duration of what genuine understanding requires when no one is rushing it to its conclusion. The training under Disapamuk was not organized around certification. There was no fixed date at which a student became a physician. There was no syllabus of competencies to be demonstrated and ticked off. The readiness was visible to the teacher, not in examination results, but in the quality of the students' questions. What they noticed, what they asked about, how they held what they didn't yet know. Jivaka learned the properties of plants, which roots reduced fever, which bark preparations healed infection, which leaves prepared, in which ways addressed which conditions of the body. He learned to look at a patient and read not just the visible symptoms, but the patterns underneath them, the relationship between what the body was showing and what the body was doing, which required a quality of attention that could not be hurried, because hurrying collapses exactly the space in which this kind of seeing happens. The texts record one of his later cases in remarkable detail. A powerful general was suffering from what sounds like a brain tumor, severe headaches, debilitating, resistant to every treatment that had been tried. Jivaka examined him carefully. He concluded that the problem required surgical intervention, a trepanning procedure, opening the skull, extracting what had grown where it should not grow. He performed the surgery. The general recovered. What is significant about this case in the context of his story is not the drama of it, but the diagnostic precision it reveals. To see what Jivaka saw in that patient, to know what the symptoms were indicating at a depth that pointed toward a surgical remedy when everyone else had concluded the case was untreatable, required eyes that had been built slowly over 7 years of attending to what was actually there, rather than to what the examining physician hoped to find or expected to find. This is the quality Disapamuk was cultivating in his student, not Speed, not the efficient acquisition of applicable techniques, but the development of a particular kind of seeing. And seeing of this kind cannot be installed. It cannot be taught by lecture. It grows through repeated, patient, unrushed encounter with what the world actually contains. And it grows specifically in the space that is vacated when the urgency to arrive at the answer is not filling it. After 7 years, Jivaka went to his teacher and said he believed his study was complete. Disapamok listened to him. Then he gave him a task. He told him to take a basket and search the land within 1 league of Takasila. The fields, the paths, the forest edges, the roadside growth, the ordinary, unremarkable plant life of the countryside around the city, and bring back any plant, any root, any bark or leaf or moss that had no medicinal value at all. Jivaka took the basket and went out. He moved through the land with the attention 7 years had built in him, turning over leaves, crouching to examine roots, looking at what grew at the base of walls and in the shade of trees and along the edges of paths where no one had planted anything intentionally. He was not looking for something rare. He was looking for something with no value at all. The smallest, most ordinary, most overlooked thing he could find that nonetheless served no purpose for any condition of any body he had ever examined. He searched the full area his teacher had described. He covered the whole league systematically without rushing through the sections he thought were less likely to produce something. He came back to Disapamok with an empty basket. He told his teacher he had searched as carefully as he knew how to search, and he could not find a single plant without medicinal value. Everything he had examined had some property, some application, some relevance to some condition he had learned to recognize. He had found nothing without use. Disapamok told him he was ready. He gave him traveling money and sent him home. The empty basket was the test passing itself. And the test had never been about finding a plant. There was no correct specimen waiting to be identified and delivered. The teacher was looking for the student who had learnt to see so carefully that the world had changed its appearance, who no longer looked at a common weed and saw only a weed, because 7 years of genuine attention had taught him that the ordinary world is full of what inattentive eyes miss. A student who was still rushing, still organized around completing the task and receiving the verdict, would have brought something back, would have picked up a rock or a dry stick and declared it without medicinal value, wanting the test to end. The empty basket is only possible from a student who was genuinely searching, who had no investment in the search producing a particular kind of answer, and who could therefore look at what was actually there rather than at what the situation seemed to require. Here is where the teaching on karma enters, not as a separate doctrine appended to the story, but as the thing the story is actually describing from the inside. The Buddha defined karma in a single precise line. It is intention, he said, that I call karma, not the action as it appears from outside, not the outcome the action produces. The quality of mind from which the action arises, the intention moving through the action like water through soil, invisible to any observer but shaping everything it touches. This relocates karma entirely from the cosmic to the psychological. Karma is not a ledger kept by an authority external to us. It is not a system of reward and punishment managed from somewhere outside the mind. It is not fate assigned before this life began, and it is not the universe eventually balancing its books in our favor or against us. These versions of karma are widely believed and almost entirely absent from the early texts. What the early texts describe is this: the quality of the intention that moves through an action shapes what that action actually is, what it does to the people it moves through, what it builds in the person performing it, what kind of world it helps to produce. Not through cosmic management, through the nature of what quality of attention actually does when it meets the world. An intention rooted in tanha, in urgency, in the need to secure the outcome, in the fear of what happens if the desired result fails to arrive, produces action that carries this urgency in it. The urgency is perceptible to the people receiving the action, even when it is carefully managed from the outside. The grip is felt in how the relationship moves, in what it costs to be the object of attention that is organized around an agenda. Over time, actions of this quality accumulate a particular kind of consequence, not because the universe is punishing insincerity, but because insincerity produces friction in every direction it flows, and friction, sustained, becomes the texture of the life that contains it. An intention rooted in genuine care, in real attention to what is actually needed, rather than what is needed to satisfy the agenda, produces action of a different quality, more responsive to what is actually there, more capable of being useful in the specific way this specific situation requires, rather than the general way that satisfies the need to feel like progress is being made. More able to find, like a physician moving through a field, what is hidden in what looks ordinary. Jivaka's 7 years were karma in this precise sense. Each day of genuine looking, each case attended to without the need to resolve it quickly, each plant examined without the assumption of already knowing what it was intention meeting the world cleanly, without the muddying of urgency. And the consequence of that intention, accumulated across 7 years, was not merely a body of knowledge. It was a quality of seeing that knowledge alone cannot produce. Eyes that could look at an entire league of countryside and return with nothing, because nothing met the criterion, because everything had value, because the 7 years had changed the quality of the eyes themselves. This is what karma actually builds, not outcomes secured by virtue, but the gradual formation of the person doing the perceiving. The seeing is the consequence. The physician who can diagnose what others miss is not rewarded with good eyes by a well-disposed universe. He has built those eyes, intention by intention, across years of attending carefully to what was actually there. And the inverse is also true. The intentions contaminated by urgency and the need to secure outcomes don't just produce friction in the world. They produce a quality of seeing that cannot find what it is not looking for. The student who came back with a plant and called it worthless would have been showing the teacher something important. that 7 years had still not loosened the grip of the need to have the right answer, and that this grip was exactly what was in the way of the seeing the healing art required. There is a second story from the texts that shows the same quality from an entirely different angle, not across 7 years, but in the space of a single confrontation. A Brahmin named Akosa came to the Buddha in anger. He was not a stranger to conflict. He had heard that his brother had converted, had given up his family's way of life, shaved his head, taken on the robe of a wandering monk, and he blamed the teacher for this. He had been working up the anger the entire walk to where the Buddha was staying. He arrived prepared. He stood before the Buddha and delivered what he had prepared. Insults, contempt, the carefully chosen words of a man who knows what will land and where. He said all of it without restraint. He was watching, even as he spoke, for the moment when the reaction would show itself, when the composure would crack, or the defensiveness surface, or the teacher reveal that he was, after all, just a man who could be wounded by words like anyone else. The Buddha waited for him to finish. Then he asked, "When you prepare a meal for guests who do not eat it, to whom does the meal belong?" Akosa said, "To the host. It returns to the one who prepared it." "I do not receive what you have brought today," the Buddha said. "It returns to you." There was a silence. Akosa looked at the man he had come to wound. He asked, "Are you not angry?" The Buddha said that a mind which has found its ground is not a surface where another person's anger can catch. What Akosa had brought, the insults, the contempt, the accumulated heat of the walkover, had nowhere to adhere. Not because the Buddha was performing equanimity, not because he was holding the reaction in place through effort, but because the reflexive movement from unpleasant contact to retaliation, the chain running its usual course, had genuinely stilled in him. Akosa sat down. He became a lay follower of the teaching that day, not because anything had been argued to him, or demonstrated to him, or proven, but because he had encountered something he had no category for, a quality of presence so completely without need that the anger he had brought had simply found no surface to grip and had returned to him still warm. What Akosa encountered is what the teaching names Khanti, and here is what is worth understanding about it. What makes it something other than suppression or spiritual performance? The stability Akosa saw was not created in that moment. It was not the Buddha deciding, as the insults arrived, to be patient. It was ground that had been built over a very long time, the same kind of time Jivaka spent in Takasila, the same quality of accumulated intention, meeting the world cleanly enough, repeatedly enough, that the reactive chain had gradually loosened its automatic hold on the next moment. Khanti is not a decision made at the point of impact. It is what becomes available in the space that years of practice builds between contact and response. The space that suppression mistakes for itself, but suppression narrows while Khanti widens. suppression holds something down. Khanti has stopped needing to hold anything because it has found something underneath the holding that holds itself. In practice, in the ordinary texture of days that are not ancient India, that do not involve abbots or Brahmin visitors, Khanti shows up in very small moments. Someone says something dismissive, and the draft of the response forms immediately. The thing that would correct the record, would make the dismissal visible, would establish that we saw what just happened and we are not going to let it stand unchallenged. The draft forms. Khanti is the capacity to see the draft forming before it has been sent. This is not suppression. The draft is seen, not pushed down. It is not indifference. What happened was registered, fully. It is the presence of a pause, brief, real, previously unavailable, between the unpleasant contact and what the reactive mind wants to do with it. That pause is what the teaching is building in us when it cultivates Khanti, not the heroic suppression of feeling, not the performance of equanimity under fire, just the gradual widening of a space that is already there, that has always been there, but that urgency and habit have filled so completely that most of us have never found it. The relationship between Khanti and Kama is not accidental. They are not two separate virtues that happen to appear in the same section of the teaching. They describe the same quality of mind from two different positions. One looking backward at what a life of clean intention builds, one looking forward at what the mind that has stopped fighting what is present can offer. Jivaka's 7 years were both at once. Each day of unrushed study was Kama, intention meeting the world without the muddying of urgency. And each day of unrushed study was also Khanti, the capacity to be present to what the plants and the cases and the teacher were actually showing, without the demand that they show it faster, or more conveniently, or in the form already anticipated. Kama and Khanti are the same water. Kama describes what the water deposits as it flows. Khanti describes the quality of the ground that lets it flow cleanly. When the mind is organized around securing outcomes, when the intention behind every action is contaminated by the need for a particular result, something happens to the quality of what we actually see. The attention narrows. It becomes selective in a particular way, filtering for what confirms the desired direction, screening out what complicates it, finding it very difficult to see the medicinal value in what was not expected to have medicinal value. The plant that doesn't fit the anticipated category gets declared worthless, placed in the basket, and delivered as the answer, because the urgency to have an answer is louder than the instruction to look carefully. When the mind has released the urgency, even slightly, even temporarily, as in a meditation sitting where the grip on the outcome loosens just enough to allow genuine looking, the attention widens. It becomes capable of receiving what is actually there rather than what was expected. The world starts to reveal structures that urgency was previously too loud to allow the ears to hear. The basket comes back empty because there is nothing that doesn't have value, and this is only visible from the position of someone who is genuinely looking rather than looking for. This is the connection that the teaching draws between releasing craving and the quality of what we receive from the world around us. And it is important to hold it precisely because it is easy to hear it wrong. The teaching is not saying that if we stop chasing outcomes, the outcomes will come to us. That is a teleological reading, and it is not what the texts support. The world is not arranged to reward the practitioner who has learned to stop grasping. Jivaka was not given a great career by a universe that noticed his 7 years of patient study. Akosa was not shown composure by a teacher whose virtue had earned him cosmic protection from the effects of anger. What the teaching is saying is more interior and more precise. That the quality of the seeing changes. That a mind no longer consumed by urgency can actually look at what is in front of it. At the plant, at the patient, at the angry man at the door, at the person we love whose behavior we cannot change, and find in what is actually there something that urgency would have prevented it from finding. Not because the world has changed, because the eyes have. Most of us are carrying a quiet account of what the effort should have produced by now. The relationship that should have deepened. The work that should have been recognized. The waiting that has gone on long enough and earned its resolution. We hold this account carefully and we consult it, and every day the balance is slightly wrong. And the wrongness accumulates into something that wears the same clothes as patience, but is actually its opposite. The slow resentment of a mind that is enduring its circumstances rather than resting in them. Kanti does not say the waiting isn't real. It does not say the effort deserves no return, or that the injustice should be swallowed quietly and called peace. It says something different and harder, that the quality of the intention we bring to this moment, right now, before any resolution has arrived, is the karma, not the outcome. The quality of how we are present to what is here, in the absence of what we hoped would also be here by now. The meal that is offered and declined returns to the host. The anger prepared for a man who declines to receive it stays with the one who prepared it. The search for what has no value returns empty-handed because the eyes built by 7 years of genuine attention have stopped being capable of finding the worthless. In each case, the consequence is not cosmic. It is the direct and natural result of what the quality of intention, sustained over time, has actually built. What cannot be rushed, then, is not the outcome. It is the quality of the seeing that genuine outcomes require. And the seeing is built in exactly the way Jivaka built his, not by enduring the years until the skill arrived, but by being genuinely present to each day of them, letting the attending change what the eyes could find, until the day came when the whole league of countryside offered nothing worthless, and the empty basket was the only honest answer. Every moment the reactive draft forms, and the mind sees it forming without immediately sending it. Every time the resentment surfaces and is held clearly rather than fed. Every sitting in which the mind notices it has been pulled away and returns, without drama, to what is actually here. The ground of Kanti is being built, not in dramatic episodes. In the unglamorous repetition of small choices about where to spend the quality of attention. This is the karma that builds the seeing. This is the Kanti that keeps the intention clean. they are the same thing, moving in the same direction, building the same ground, slowly, unannounced, in the ordinary material of ordinary days. And yet, even as the ground of Kunti deepens, even as the seeing clears and the reactive chain loosens its automatic grip, there remains something the mind is holding that it has not yet examined. Not what it is chasing, not how urgently it is trying, but what it has made itself out of, the identity it has built from what it has accumulated, the story it keeps telling about who is doing this practice and what that person is owed, the deepest grip of all, the one the mind mistakes for the self that is doing the releasing. The mind that has been working to release craving has, in doing so, often been building something else. Not deliberately, not through any failure of sincerity, but in the very act of noticing the reactive chain and choosing not to follow it, of sitting with difficulty without retaliating, of learning to tell the difference between tanha and chanda. There has been something watching this work and keeping its own account. A record of progress. A sense of having understood something that others have not yet understood. A quiet measuring of the distance now visible between the reactive self of before and the practicing self of now. An investment, subtle, almost invisible, in being someone who is doing this kind of inner work. Who knows what tanha is? Who has sat with the question of the chase and come away cleaner? And underneath this, a belief, so fundamental it barely registers as a belief, that there is a fixed and continuous self here who is doing the work and who will benefit from it. A self who is practicing, making progress, accumulating insight the way the king's father accumulated gold, vault by vault. This is the last and subtlest form of the chase, not the reach toward pleasure, not the frantic seeking of the becoming self, but the quiet grip on the one who is releasing, the practitioner identity that has been forming in the background of every genuine moment of letting go, mistaking itself for liberation rather than recognizing itself as the final obstacle to it. The teaching names this territory with great care. Upadana, clinging. The fourth link in dependent origination, the step after craving, where craving solidifies into grasping, where wanting hardens into identification, where the mind begins to build its sense of self from what it holds. And the teaching describes 4 forms of upadana, because clinging is not one thing, and the forms it takes become progressively more hidden as we move through them. The first form is kamupadana, clinging to sensual pleasures. This is the most visible form, the one we recognize in ourselves with least resistance. The mind reaches toward what is pleasant and resists the moment when it begins to leave. We hold the good meal in mind after the last bite. We replay the warm conversation long after it has ended. We try to keep the pleasant feeling in place, even as conditions carry it elsewhere, the way the king's consorts were arranged to invoke the pleasant tone of what Ratapal had chosen to leave behind. Most of us recognize kamupadana when it is pointed out. We may not be able to immediately release it, but we can see it clearly enough to know what is being described. The difficulty is that recognizing the most visible form of clinging often creates the impression that we are now dealing with clinging, that the work is essentially about managing desire for pleasant things. And so we miss the forms that operate much further in. The second form is ditupadana, clinging to views. This one is significantly harder to see because views present themselves not as objects being held, but as things that are simply true. The person caught in ditupadana does not experience themselves as grasping at a view. They experience themselves as knowing something. The view feels like reality, not like a position being defended. What makes ditupadana particularly relevant for someone engaged with the teaching is that the teaching itself can become an object of this kind of clinging. The understanding of tanha, of dependent origination, of the difference between tanha and chanda, all of this can be held as a view about how the mind works, a framework that is not being lived but is being stored and defended and used to evaluate others. The person who has learned the vocabulary of non-attachment and deploys it to demonstrate their understanding is not practicing non-attachment. They are attached to having understood non-attachment. The third form is silabatupadana, clinging to rules and rituals, to the forms of practice separated from what the practice is actually for. The meditation that has become a performance rather than a genuine attending. The generosity that is more about being seen to be generous than about the actual effect on the person receiving it. The ethical care that has become a system of self-management rather than a genuine response to what each situation calls for. The form is maintained. The form has become the point. And the gap between the form and what the form was supposed to produce has been quietly filled in with the assumption that the form and the substance are the same thing. The fourth form is attavadupadana, clinging to the doctrine of self, to the belief in a permanent and substantial entity that persists through time, that is living this life and doing this practice and will be the one who benefits from whatever liberation arrives. This is the root from which the other three grow, and it is the last to be seen clearly. Because to see it clearly, we have to examine the very mind that is doing the examining, turn the light of attention back on the one holding the light. There was a monk in the Buddha's time who showed what ditupadana looks like up close, and whose story opened the teaching that contains two of the most important similes in the early texts. His name was Arita. He had been practicing for some time, had learned the teaching thoroughly, had gained genuine knowledge of how the teaching was formulated, and he had arrived at a conclusion that seemed to him entirely reasonable, that what the Buddha consistently described as obstacles to the path were not, in his analysis, actually obstacles. Specifically, that sensual pleasures, which the teaching treated as entanglements, were not really so problematic for someone who understood them clearly. This is the texture of ditupadana, not a crude holding of an obvious wrong view, but the careful construction of an argument from within the teaching that arrives at a conclusion more convenient to the self than the teaching itself supports. Arita had learned the teaching well enough to build a case inside it. And having built the case, he could not hear the counter-arguments, because the case felt like understanding rather than like a position being defended. Other monks challenged him. They pointed directly to the Buddha's words on sensual pleasures, the similes, the discourses, the direct teaching of the 4 kinds of clinging. Arita was not moved. He continued to hold his view. Eventually, a group of monks went to the Buddha and described what Arita was saying. The Buddha sent for Arita and asked him directly, "Is this true? Do you hold this view?" Arita confirmed it, openly, to the teacher himself. This is the quality of Dhitupadana at full strength. It persists even when the teacher points directly at it. Because to the one clinging, it does not feel like clinging. It feels like accuracy. The Buddha turned to the other monks and asked if they recognized this view from his teaching. They said no. Then the Buddha used a simile. A man wants a snake. He goes into the wild looking for one. He finds a large, powerful snake and he reaches for it, but he does not grasp it at the head, the way someone who understands what they are handling would grasp it. He grabs it by the tail or by the middle of the coils. The snake turns and bites him, on the hand, on the arm, wherever the grip has left him exposed. He suffers badly because of how he grasped. The teaching is like the snake. Grasped correctly, by the head, with real understanding of what it is and what it is for, it is exactly what it claims to be, a path out of suffering. Grasped wrongly, for what it gives the self who holds it, for the identity it confers, for the arguments it wins, for the distance it creates between the one who has understood and those who have not. It bites. Not because the teaching is dangerous, because the grasping is. Grasping the teaching by the wrong end takes forms that are less obvious than Arita's case. The person who studies what the Buddha taught about impermanence and uses that understanding to justify emotional unavailability, nothing lasts anyway, so why commit fully, is holding the snake by the tail. The teaching is in the hands, and it is biting. The person who has learned the language of non-attachment and deploys it as a way of maintaining superiority over those who are still suffering in more obvious ways. Who can describe the nature of tanha while being deeply attached to being seen as someone who has transcended tanha is holding the snake by the middle coils. The person whose spiritual understanding has become a sophisticated system for evaluating others' ignorance, who uses the teaching's vocabulary to diagnose what is wrong with everyone else's approach, who is sharper and quicker in pointing out others' upadana than in examining their own. The snake is biting already, even if the wound has not yet been noticed. Then the Buddha offered a second simile, one that addresses not how the teaching is misused, but what the right relationship to it actually is. A traveler is on a journey. He reaches a body of water, wide, unknown in its depth, without any bridge or visible ford. On the far bank is where he needs to go. This bank is dangerous. He cannot stay here. He gathers what is available: wood, vines, grasses from the bank, and builds a raft. It is simple. It is sufficient for what it needs to do. He uses it to cross the water. He poles himself to the far bank and arrives. Now, what should he do with the raft? If he thinks, "This raft served me well, I will put it on my head and carry it," would this be the right use of the raft? It would not, the Buddha said. The raft was for the crossing. The crossing is done. Leave the raft at the bank and continue. Even the Dhamma, the Buddha said, should be let go of, to say nothing of what is not the Dhamma. Sit with that for a moment. Even the Dhamma, the teaching itself, the very understanding that has brought the mind this far, should be let go of. Not before the crossing. The raft is necessary. The crossing requires it. But the raft is not the destination, and a traveller carrying a raft on their head is not walking freely on the far bank. They are walking with a raft on their head. The carrying is often invisible to the one doing it because the raft was built with such genuine effort and carried the person through such real water that it has become inseparable in their mind from the crossing itself. To put it down feels like putting down the crossing. To release the teaching feels like losing the understanding the teaching produced. And so the raft stays on the head, honoured, respected, referred to constantly, while the far bank, the actual territory that was the point of the crossing, remains largely unexplored. What carrying the raft looks like, the practitioner who, years into the practice, relates to other people primarily through the framework of how much they have understood about the nature of suffering. Who encounters a friend's distress and has difficulty with it unless the friend is capable of receiving the teaching's vocabulary for what distress is? Who has built, gradually, a spiritual hierarchy in their mind, the awake and the not yet awake, the practicing and the sleeping, and who inhabits one side of that hierarchy with a certainty that is itself the most vivid form of the chase still running. The raft is on the head of the meditator who monitors every sitting against a standard of what a productive sitting looks like, who ends sessions with a verdict on their quality, who tracks a personal record of stillness and distraction across years of practice, who is proud of the practice and therefore invested in the practice, producing something that justifies the pride. The Sila Bhattupadana in this is not the meditation itself. The form is good, the sitting is right. It is the additional layer of self-evaluation that has attached to the form, turning each sitting from a genuine encounter with what is present into a performance being measured against what a practitioner should be producing. The heaviest form of the raft is the last one, the one most difficult to name because it is so quiet about what it is. Throughout all of this, through everything heard in this sitting, everything understood or half understood or resisted, there has been something taking it all in, processing, weighing, finding parts of it moving and parts of it challenging. There has been, in other words, a sense of a someone here, a listener, a practitioner, someone for whom this teaching is being offered and who is receiving it and doing something with what they receive. This sense is so ordinary, so unremarkable, so apparently self-evident that we barely notice it as a sense at all. It is the water the fish swims in, invisible not because it is hidden but because it is everywhere, the medium through which every experience arrives. And this is what Attavādapadana clings to, the view that what presents itself as I is a permanent, substantial entity that persists across time, the same self that was here yesterday and will be here tomorrow, that owns its experiences, that will possess whatever liberation its practice earns. The Anatta teaching, not self, is one of the most fundamental in the early texts and one of the most persistently misread. The misreading goes in two directions. One reading hears it as nihilism. There is no self, therefore nothing matters, therefore the practitioner is an illusion and the practice is pointless. The other reading hears it as a puzzle to be philosophically solved. If there is no self, then who is it that reincarnates? Who accumulates karma? Who attains nibbana? Both readings miss what the teaching is actually saying. Anatta is not a claim that there is nothing here. It is a precise observation about the nature of what is here. What we call self is a process, not a thing. It is not a fixed entity that has experiences. It is a pattern of experiencing that arises from conditions. Consider a flame. A flame is not a thing. It has no fixed substance. At any given moment, it is a process, fuel oxidizing, energy releasing, the reaction maintaining a form long enough to appear as an object. The flame burning now is not the same flame that was burning a moment ago. Different molecules, different oxygen, a continuously renewed process that holds the same shape long enough to be given a name and pointed at. But there is no flame entity persisting through the changes. There is only the process, moment after moment, arising from conditions. The self is like this. Moment to moment, the sense of I is reconstructed from new elements, new Vedana, new perceptions, new contact arising and passing. The continuity is real enough for practical life. We are right to use the pronoun, right to hold ourselves responsible for what the pattern did yesterday, right to make plans for what the pattern will do tomorrow. But the fixity, the permanent self that possesses its experiences and stores them as property, is the view that generates suffering. Because a process cannot own what it moves through, and the attempt to make it do so is the root of upadana at every level. This is what makes even the practitioner's accumulation of insight a form of clinging, when it is experienced as something the self now has, rather than as a change in what the process is doing. The insight is real. The change in the quality of seeing is real. But when the insight becomes mine, something I have and you don't, something that distinguishes me from where I was, something that the permanent self is now carrying as an asset, the flame is pretending to be a stone. And the pretending is the last form of the chase. Even this. What remains when even this is released? When even the practitioner identity has been seen clearly enough that it can no longer serve as the hidden engine of a subtler seeking, is described in the early texts with the word upekkha, the fourth Brahmavihara, the fourth of the four immeasurable qualities, after metta and karuna and mudita, translated as equanimity, though equanimity in English points towards something that upekkha is specifically not. We tend to hear equanimity as composure, as the achievement of a mind that has become sufficiently undisturbed by life's fluctuations to maintain a stable surface. A kind of sophisticated, not minding. And this is exactly the misreading the texts are careful to prevent. Upekkha, the texts insist, is not the equanimity of indifference, not the mind that has achieved stability by withdrawing its investment from what happens to it. That is not a far bank. That is the person who has decided not to cross at all. Upekkha is something more demanding than indifference. It requires full contact with the world. Everything received, nothing filtered, and a ground stable enough that this full contact does not move the mind into reactive management of what it receives. The contact happens. The Vedana arises. The pleasant is pleasant, and the unpleasant is unpleasant. But the reflexive leap from Vedana to Tanha, from feeling to the demand that the feeling be different, has released its automaticity. Metta, Karuna, and Mudita can each still carry a thread of the self's investment in how things go. The loving mind that wishes well-being for another may still feel something if the other person rejects the wish, may still require some response from the beloved in order to fully rest. The compassionate heart that moves towards suffering may also carry some of the weight of what it encounters, may leave each meeting with pain, having absorbed something of what it witnessed. The rejoicing mind may flicker when the comparison between another's fortune and one's own becomes too present. Upekkha is what these three qualities become when even these last threads of self-investment have released. Metta, without the need for the beloved to receive the metta. Karuna, without the compassionate one carrying away what the encounter with suffering deposited in them. Mudita, without the comparison. Full warmth, full movement toward what suffers, full joy in what thrives, and a ground that remains stable through all of it, not because the ground has withdrawn from the contact, but because the ground has stopped needing the contact to be other than what it is. The texts from the sutta where the Buddha taught through the night describe this upekkha as purified and bright. Those two words are precise. Purified, cleared of the sediment of upadana, the four forms of clinging that muddied the quality of attention at every level, from the reaching for sensual pleasures, through the defending of views, through the performance of forms, through the maintenance of the self that was doing all the above. Bright, not dim, not flat, not reduced in its engagement with the world. More alive to experience, because the energy that was going into the management of experience has been freed. The upekkha person is not the one who seems undisturbed because they are not fully present. They are the one who is more present than usual, receiving the contact without the layer of agenda that normally processes it. Akosa brought insults to a mind like this, and the insults had nowhere to adhere. Not because the Buddha was not listening, but because the listening was so complete, the contact so fully received, that there was no gap for the defensive self to occupy. In ordinary life, upekkha looks different from what we might expect. The parent who loves a child with upekkha is not less invested in the child. They are more attentive because they are attending to the child as the child actually is, rather than filtering the child through the picture of who the child should be for the parent's sake. The love is complete. The presence is complete. What is absent is the investment in outcome, the need for the child to become a particular kind of person in order for the loving to feel like it has worked. The practitioner who sits in upekkha is not sitting in emptiness. Restlessness arises and is fully present to restlessness, not managing it, not monitoring it against a standard, not carrying the extra layer of judgment about whether this session is going well. Stillness arises and is fully present to stillness, not grasping it, not checking if it will last, not adding to its quality the additional quality of being proud of having achieved it. Each moment received as it is, without the commentary running alongside it that evaluates each moment against what the moment should be instead. This is what the raft becomes once it has been set down. Not nothing. Something that has been transformed by no longer being carried, the understanding still there, the insight still present, the years of practice still woven into how the eyes see, but no longer organized around the project of the self who has the understanding. The flame still burning, still warm, still bright, and no longer pretending to be a stone. Everything in this sitting has been spiraling toward this. We began with the obvious form of the chase, tanha as the reaching for pleasure and the flight from pain, the fourth of the summaries Ratapala gave to the king. The world is insatiate, the slave of craving. We move to the chase that hides in effort, the forcing, the demanding, the refusal to allow the natural pace of genuine understanding. We moved to the chase that hides in waiting, the account keeping, the quiet resentment of delay, and the kamma of clean intention that is its alternative. And now here, the chase that was hiding in the one doing all of this work. Even this, even the releasing, even the understanding of tanha, even the insight into the chain, even the patient tending, even this sitting, and the practitioner who is sitting in it, the raft, all of it, carried to the bank and set down. Not abandoned before the crossing, not dismissed as worthless after it. Set down at the bank where a raft belongs when the crossing is complete, so that the traveller who built it can continue, lighter, with both hands free, onto the far bank, which has a name, and the name is not what the name seems to promise. The name the Buddha gave to the far bank is Nibbana. In Pali, the word means the blowing out of a flame. And because of this, it has often been heard as the practice's final verdict on what we are: extinguished, gone, reduced to nothing by the long work of releasing what we held. The flame that is blown out is not the person. It is the craving, the thirst that was driving the search, the tanha that kept the chain running, link by link, moment by moment, through every hour of seeking that did not yet understand that it was the seeking itself that was the suffering. What remains when that flame is blown out is not emptiness. It is what was always present beneath it. A stillness the fire was never able to reach. A quality of awareness that was never actually burning, only hidden by the heat of the wanting. There, before the first craving arose, and here when the craving ceases. The Dhammapada says, "The greatest victory is not thousands of people conquered in battle. It is the self met clearly and no longer fled from." This is what letting go of the chase comes to. The mind returned to itself. Present, clear, no longer spending itself on the distance between here and where it believed it needed to be. The chase, finally understood, and in the understanding, released.